Thank you for those words, and thank you for the organizers, Amita Facharia and Huda Mahmoudi, for inviting me here. Thank you for your presence. I'm going to talk a little bit more in conventional IR terms at the beginning, but I do open up to a discussion on civilization, particularly African civilization, and what it can bring to globalization and global governance. So I want to talk in terms of the theme of this conference, a changing and reconfiguring world order. A world order after hegemony, I might add. And this, I think, is important because such a world opens the space for a greater participation by the South, including by one of its parts, that of the African continent. So this presentation will look at how and why world order is changing, how African leadership and civilization may contribute alongside others to restoring a new social understanding of world order and its institutions, and in doing so, expand the political and moral basis of such an order. And I think in this, African humanity, with its history, civilizations, cultures, ideas, and norms, can make an important contribution. And yes, I will do and mention Nelson Mandela as part of this. Presentation comes in three parts. I first want to talk about the problem of a disordered, or should we call it a disorderly world, and how the voice of the South is needed in it. The second raises the issue of culture and how to relate it to advancing global dialogue, and how best to do this, address it in terms of images and ideas that can be used to promote such a dialogue, can be used to promote new communities and perhaps convergence. I end on some specific approaches that African civilizational values might suggest, and then conclude. But first, to the problem. Our disordered or disorderly world, however we want to look at it, and the voice of the South and reconfiguring world order. I would like to believe we meet here today because we've all realized we all live in a disordered world, one that needs our attention. It is thus of great necessity to think how world order can be reconfigured. The magisterial Eric Hobsbawm, historian, now late, talking about the state of the world at the turn of the millennium, says, quote, "The future cannot be a continuation of the past, and there are signs both internally and externally that we have reached a point of historic crisis. The structures of human societies themselves, including some of the social foundations of the capitalist economy, on the point of being destroyed. Our world must change," unquote. This is as true today as when it was written. Georges Monbiot reminds us that the globalization of corporates and finance allows us to think in terms of a new planetary class struggle between those who exponentially accumulate at the expense of the vast majority. The effect of this is to desocialize and denature the economy, if you will. The late Susan Strange, many years ago, referred us to casino capitalism, a kind of economy that has little affinity for meeting primary human needs. And certainly Africa has been at the receiving end of a predatory world economic system over a very long stretch of time. Global measures and institutions are needed to bring about greater equity, and equality. And global governance happens without the majority for the most part at the moment. But we all know that it needs to happen with the majority participating. Now, change is a process, not an event. We talk about a post-industrial, post-Cold War, post-9/11, post-nationalist, post-colonial globalizing world. And the past, as these descriptions suggest, lives on into the present. But the past, with its ideas and institutions of diminishing returns for all, including importantly now also for those who have the enormous responsibility for reproducing the present world order, no longer makes the political and moral sense it once did. It simply has less grip. Think of the G7-8 grouping, the United Nations Security Council, the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank, for instance, or the USA in the light of Guantanamo or rendition. In a weakening international order, southern states and societies who have a great stake in upholding international rules, more so than the currently powerful states, do have a role to play. And certainly Africa, which can no longer be seen as in the past, as an intruder and have not from the outside wishing to change international rules, has a part to play here as well. And that is evident from the G8's outreach, as in the G8 8+5 a few years ago. It's obvious from the African role played at the WTO, the G20, or in BRICS, that speaks to the recognition of African agency. Not only are the social conditions produced by a world economic order in question, Western leadership and its cultural and moral supremacy are in doubt. Amin Maalouf asks whether humanity has reached a threshold of moral incompetence, where we are facing a disordered world caused in part by the social shortcomings of our economic system, as well as by the slide from ideology to identity. This despite the fact that with the full-scale adoption of the market system by all after 1990, Western civilization and norms have intruded on all societies more than ever. Earlier on, we heard the ambassador talking about hamburger and Coca-Cola bringing us all together. But Southern societies, in incorporating Western consumerism, are increasingly modernizing on their own terms. And the generation of own wealth has come with demonstrations of own agency in the South. And this agency refashions the points at which power and culture intersect. As such, the South is eroding the cultural dominance of the West. And this spells change for a Western-led world order. First, what is suggested here is a change of attitude. Humility and openness instead of intolerance, unilateralism, arrogance, superciliousness, or chauvinism. More than this, as Bassam Tibi points out in talking about the Western and Islamic world talking to each other, what is needed is a new international morality. A morality of respecting and regarding the other as a valuable partner in a dialogue that is outcomes-oriented. This suggests the need for an infusion of voices and participation from the South. We need independent African and other voices to contribute actively in reconfiguring world order. Having been at the receiving end of world orders, present and past, African voices have much to contribute to reconfiguring the future. Those voices who have been subject to a particular form of culturally and socially sustained power can use their own civilizational culture to invite a more inclusive, participative world. As Pankaj Mishra points out, amidst a spreading sense of Western hypocrisy, failure, and retrenchment since 9/11, quote, the sense of humiliation that burdened several generations of Asians has greatly diminished, unquote. The same can be said of Africa, where a new generation of Africans, including African women, I'm thinking of the late Wangari Maathai, the environmental activist and peace activist Leymah Gbowee, both Nobel Prize winners, assert their individual sovereignty in the world in new ways and in the context of a changing, hybridizing modernity, no longer exclusively shaped by the West. Southern voices have for a century critiqued Western-led economistic development. A reconfigured world order needs to work towards restoring social meaning and legitimacy in the way the world economy and global institutions work. Values such as solidarity, empathy, opportunity, equity, redress, human rights and security, justice, again need to be brought to the fore to expand on the social meaning of development. The creativity towards achieving this is not just contained in new technologies, but also in old cultures and civilizations. And the latter, I suggest, needs to find its way towards refashioning parts of the international. The rise of Asia, Africa, and South America, the assertiveness of its people and cultures today, intrude on a Eurocentric world. Importantly, Pankaj Mishra, speaking for Asia, says that it is equally true that this is happening at the time today when, quote, no convincingly universalist response exists to Western ideas of politics and economy, even though these seem increasingly febrile and dangerously unsuitable in large parts of the world, unquote. Perhaps it's a really good thing that there is no competing universalist claim to a new world order from Asia, Africa, or South America, at a time when the present world order has ceased to carry meaning for many in an emerging structure of world order that has become a composite of overlapping elements. At what is a novel interpolar moment of time in history, where we have both interdependence and polarity existing at the same time. This may be a point at which we break the back of having another hegemon succeed the present one. Amitav Acharya himself pertinently raises the issue of post-hegemony. He squarely puts the question to what extent an era of normative multilateralism which implicitly relies on dialogue and negotiation, can replace the present multilateralism based on material powers or resistance to it. This is because one of the key challenges facing IR is our collective failure under the present dispensation to foster its development as a two-way dialogue. Richard Falk cautions, though, that such a dialogue is complicated by sharply divergent perceptual perspectives, uneven material circumstances, and historical memories, by a bewildering array of shifting policy challenges. The South African intellectual Joel Netithenze simply asserts that it is perhaps time for the black man's burden, for African assertiveness and self-definition in pursuit of excellence and acting as a force of example of what it means to be human and humane needs now to come forward to help shape a new civilization. This then is the time when the different regions of the world begin to make their voices heard. This is possible in a world where societies are now largely unable to isolate themselves culturally. And the conditions are right now at the stage of post-hegemony for a moral debate to happen across societies. Before these voices can be heard beyond their regions, however, political power, say on the African continent, should go along with the deepening of human rights to be legitimate. Nelson Mandela made the point that interrogating the legitimacy of political power on the African continent needs consideration. I quote, "Certainly, colonialism and the selfish ordering of world affairs, past and present, have undermined Africa's development. And it is not only just that Africa should demand her fair share of world resources, that we should challenge the untenable global division of power and wealth. But Africa has long traversed a mindset that seeks to heap all blame on the past and on others. The era of Renaissance we are entering is and should be based on our own efforts as Africans to change Africa's conditions for the better. If Africa's children, like all other children, should shelter a light of hope in their hearts about what life can offer, then we, as their parents and leaders, deserve to be judged by the same standards as anyone else. In this regard, we face the urgent task of deepening the culture of human rights on the continent. We are called upon to ensure that our social structures reflect the will of the people. Our approach to issues of political power should proceed from the premise that it is an expression of popular will and not a mysterious force wielded by a chosen few," unquote. So what do we make about culture? How do we approach it in bringing us to a dialogue that can help us transform? In the United States, it is the myths around the American Revolution and its founding fathers, plus the Constitution as a grounding document, that have been the images which give Americans their political identity. Promise of equality, freedom, and justice over more than 2 centuries has allowed for a common political culture of embedded beliefs and rulemaking. But it's not just impersonal or authoritarian rules per se that hold individuals and communities together in a political and social system. It is also the belief that the rules reflect shared and common values which can guide our behavior towards one another. common political culture in a society of difference. Sorry, it's not responding. Common political culture in a society of difference is made possible by images and ideas to produce sets of values around which rules are constructed and internalized to promote convergence. If only it were that easy. We do also know that the United States, in the meantime, no longer functions as a melting pot of cultures and rules, as it may have in the past. And that values around what is stereotypically American is now contested. Culture now intrudes. Culture complicates. The old universalism is imperiled, and culture is feared. David Landis tells us how we academics, for instance, veer away from dealing with culture. Quote, culture in the sense of the inner values and attitudes that guide a population frightens scholars. It has a sulfuric odor of race and inheritance, an air of immutability, unquote. Certainly, a warning is not out of order when discussing culture and identity in politics. Culture as a political instrument on its own can be threatening. The notion that religions, ethnic identities, and cultures are unique and need their own space in the world requires careful handling. Amin Maalouf reminds us, apartheid or separate development in South Africa, with its notion of separate but equal, was built on the idea of the uniqueness of each nationality. Maalouf tells us that this spirit of apartheid is ubiquitous in the world today. The insistence on cultural and religious separateness can obstruct the dialogue that can lead to convergence. But it is only in dialogue that synthesis can hope to happen and outcomes towards inclusivity occur. While difference should be recognized, it should not be reified by submerging the individual in a group or community. The specter of immediately assigning a Muslim to a group that is seen as threatening in its totality is a case in point. It should not stop us from treating each other with our differences as individuals and as a whole human being, as Bassam Tibi tells us, who goes on to say that human rights may be a Western notion, but ways must be found for individuals across cultures, despite their governments, to understand and embrace and promote human rights in expanded ways. We need a dialogue aimed at creating a new transcultural understanding of human rights and how to respect and protect them. It should be driven by the realization that where individuals' rights often compete with collective rights nowadays, this transcultural understanding can best be achieved by harmonizing or synchronizing collective social and cultural rights with human rights. In doing so, human rights will no longer be seen as a hegemonic project by the West, selectively pushing it to realize its own political and economic interests. Treating others as a whole human being means you afford all individuals the chance to prove their talent and take part in the life around them. As Bill Clinton put it when Nelson Mandela visited the United States, quote, in every gnarly, knotted, distorted situation in the world where people are kept from becoming the best they can be, there is an apartheid of the heart. And if we really honor this stunning sacrifice of 27 years of Mandela's time on Robben Island, it will be to do whatever we can, however we can, wherever we are, to take the apartheid out of our own and others' hearts, unquote. So what to do? How to advance dialogue on convergence and convergence, using culture and its images and metaphors in a positive way. The late African IR scholar Ali Mazrui, perhaps more at home in dealing with culture and less afraid of race. After all, Africa, more than any other continent, is home to probably the most diverse range of human beings anywhere on this earth, reminded us that, quote, culture is at the heart of the nature of power in international relations, unquote. He also reminded us that the power of culture can also be seen as a protective shield for freedom. If culture is to open us up to others and embrace new communities, it needs to be accompanied by appropriate ideas, metaphors, and images. I live on a continent where new forms of political community are extensively sought. It is from the continent of Africa, for instance, that the notion of a state nation, not a nation state, a state nation, comes. This is where the state is central to the business of transcending nationalities and neutralizing local political cultures, where it has tasked itself to build national identity, morality, values to live by, and instill a sense of nationhood. The idea of nation building has been a powerful image, certainly in the past, and taken different forms. Just two examples. Tanzania under Mwalimu Nyerere is one example where this succeeded admirably. Ethnic languages were confined to the home, and Kiswahili came to be elevated to a truly national language, a unifying medium. Together with a project to build a social, communal type of economy for a time, this single language helped build a national identity in a unified, socially cohesive, peaceful, lawful, independent, and stable Tanzania. Tanzania, as you will know, is not just a multicultural, but also a multi-religious society. Tanzania used this social and cultural power to transport itself onto the international stage, to become an international player, negotiator, mediator on global issues to do with ending cultures of oppression, colonialism, and apartheid. The positive resonance of this past lives on in today's Tanzania. In a democratic South Africa, the idea of a rainbow nation was based on a negotiated end to apartheid rule and a constitutional state with a set of evolving rights and freedoms. And this has been thought invaluable in starting to overcome past cultural, racial, socioeconomic divisions. This in order to build equitable, social democratic outcomes and a non-racial, non-sexist society to boot. Nelson Mandela, standing for positive, peaceful change based on reconciliation and dialogue, exemplifies how people could start this process globally. Changing sets of discourses, ideas, and symbolic representations can change or create new political and economic communities, also by non-state actors across the globe. Nelson Mandela's example has moved beyond Africa and become of global significance. His contribution to the struggle internationally and the promotion of a culture of peace throughout the world is recognized in Mandela Day. It enjoins states, organizations, and individuals to give in selfless public service towards the improvement of individual lives, and makes a call for mutual solidarity in promoting tangible global development and social upliftment. I've totally neglected this. What drove Mandela and what he represents to this day is his faith that a deep commitment to human rights and an inclusive approach to development realized in dialogue and practical action restores human dignity, provides opportunity, and lessens inequality. This implies that previously excluded voices must be heard, that they possess legitimacy and integrity and can help shape development in general. In this spirit, Africa as a regional civilization interacting with the rest of the world has the potential to help infuse and reconfigure the universal. So let me just say a little bit more specifically about Africa's civilizational contribution. The demand for the respect of human dignity in all spheres, notably in international relations, development and governance, but also in the way we treat each other at an interpersonal level, is the most culturally powerful message and tool for world betterment to emerge from the continent. Africa is perhaps the most outstanding example of where synthesizing past oppression with a new agency to assert culture as a shield for freedom, to achieve dignity through participation, stands out as something to be followed. Nelson Mandela, talking of Carthage, a city that at one point possessed resources at least as great as Rome's and came to threaten Europe and Rome itself under Hannibal, in his speech to the Organization of African Unity in 1994, captured the new political and cultural moment for Africa and a changing world in the following way, in quotes, quote, "In the distant days of antiquity, a Roman sentenced this African city to death. Carthage must be destroyed." And Carthage was destroyed. All human civilization rests on foundations such as the ruins of the African city of Carthage. These architectural remains, like the pyramids of Egypt, the sculptures of the ancient kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Benin, the temples of Ethiopia, the Zimbabwe ruins, and the rock paintings of the Kalahari and Namib deserts all speak of Africa's contribution to the formation of the condition of civilization, unquote. In the 20th century, he goes on, the ancient pride of the peoples of our continent asserted itself by their deeds, by the struggles they led. These and many other patriots said to us that neither Carthage nor Africa had been destroyed. They conveyed the message that the long interregnum of humiliation was over. It says to all who will listen and understand that by ending the apartheid barbarity that was the offspring of European colonization, Africa has once more contributed to the advance of human civilization and further expanded the frontiers of liberty everywhere, unquote. In other words, with the liberation of South Africa, Africa as a whole could now begin to put an end to externally induced or supported cycles of oppression and domination, symbolized by the destruction of Carthage at one end and apartheid on the other. Only now could the African voice fully contribute to global governance. Notwithstanding the ongoing disappointment of African citizens with many of their rulers across 54 states, Mandela's example holds promise beyond a tainted nationalist project. Integration centered on Pan-African ideals, the softening of petty state boundaries, regional consolidation, and future participatory forms of regional governance are likely to open up new space for new freedoms, inclusive development, and accountability. Pan-Africanism wants to establish the conditions which will have historically conscious Africans in solidarity with each other transcontinentally take charge of their own development for the benefit of African welfare and progress. If we want to assume that a new sense of self should bring us more inclusive regional world orders, where the power of culture is reconfigured, we also need to recognize that the moment has arrived where one ought to work in a practical way towards the convergence of regionally situated civilizations. To achieve this, we do not need to probe the inner lives and values of communities or to express any angst about race. Bringing neighboring civilizations closer together can be done by investigating how to get different community or nation-based cultures to harmonize within nation states as well as across civilizations in the world, as indeed Nelson Mandela attempted. Mandela, as the most prominent global figure of the late 20th century, helped reverse centuries of stereotypical myths about Africans and overcame the binary thinking on oppressors and the oppressed. He showed that while the oppressed needed to be freed of their physical chains, the oppressor also needed to be freed from the mental chains of oppression, so that in dialogue, new energies for development, a new civilizational order could be attempted. This is instructive for us thinking globally. Mandela stands for managing diversity in a transforming, more equitable setting in order to bring about convergence through dialogue. At a global level, such a drive should help change the ethos of international politics and address the unintended ecological consequences of economism and possessive individualism in the quest to achieve a truly authentic culture of harmony, as Tu Wai Ming reminds us. But Mandela is not just an individual. Mandela is a product of African civilizational norms in sub-Saharan Africa, built on communitarian thinking around community and harmony, brought about by a duty to exhibit solidarity. Tadeusz Hetz finds, quote, sub-Saharan values are unjustly neglected in global debates among moral theorists, unquote. In assessing the contribution of African civilization, and that the contribution it can bring to global dialogue, Martha Nussbaum reminds us, Africans have a profound understanding between the connections of past and present, between human beings and nature, of our common humanity and of a shared spirituality. Africans have mastered the art of communication between ancestors of the past and those in the present, as well as dialogue between all of us, plants, birds, and animals included, who live together in a way that creates shared meaning and communal understanding, unquote. Nussbaum goes on to say, like other cultures which are more communal and less individualistic, African mechanisms for processing what is happening in a group in a dignified and participatory way are extremely well developed. African social technologies exemplify the art of negotiating with each other in a way not seen in Western countries. Mandela comes from the praxis of Ubuntu, a manifestation of African communitarian philosophy. The African philosophy of Ubuntu is one where a person is a person through other persons, or I am because we are. Produces a morality that is relational in ways that Western morality is not. The only way to become fully human here is to relate to others in a positive way. Martha Nussbaum goes on. Relations are expressed in communal ways, which implies respecting community, in other words, harmony. And harmony is best achieved by striving for the common good, by community service and community belongingness. It implies having property distribution which respects the community, since great inequalities of wealth do not, in a relational sense, foster a sense of togetherness or harmony. Nussbaum goes on, in its practical manifestation, the African social philosophy Ubuntu embraces any actions that expresses an individual, organizational, corporate, or governmental commitment to expressing compassion, caring, sharing, and responsiveness to the community as a whole. The African sense of community obligation that goes beyond charity is just what is needed to foster economic rights and have us think beyond the sanctity of the liberal individualist paradigm, unquote. Mandela, in seeking reconciliation through dialogue and openness, sought to create a new morality meant to engender positive, remedial, and strategically oriented development. The now famous and highly respected Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa did embrace the values of Ubuntu through its decision to grant amnesty to perpetrators who were willing to tell the truth about the nature of what they did, their crimes towards others, their political opponents, and to apologize directly to the victims of those they had tortured or killed. The decision was made in the service of community healing over retribution and in order to contribute to the project of nation building as opposed to further divisiveness. In conclusion, Enlightenment notions of a universal, secularized, Enlightenment notions of a universal, secularized world based on common values centered on the individual, rational self-interest are being contested. This is because where global or regional governance happens at the behest of particular, let us say, economistic elites, we will not have a common political culture that tackles vital issues to do with holistic, inclusive, and sustainable development. Any reconfigured world order needs a morality and a dialogue that takes remedial action towards greater equality and justice. We need dialogues across the many areas of globalization, including that of global discourse and knowledge, to throw up policies, regimes, and institutions that are less elite-based. Identity has cumulatively fed into the contestations about where we're going since 1990. Culture and religion in an age of identity politics are here to stay. They need to be engaged in order to have different civilizations, including African civilization, dig deep to help frame a global debate on the common issues that confront the world and its institutions. Where this does not happen, where institutional participation is not fully inclusive, geographic, cultural, ethnic, and religious factors come into their own. They reproduce apartheid notions of separate and equal development and contribute to the dissolution, the further loosening of world order. The demand for the respect of human dignity in all spheres, notably in international relations, development, and governance, but also in the way we treat each other at an interpersonal level, is a powerful cultural tool for world betterment to emerge from the African continent. With it goes the message of inclusiveness. Africa is perhaps the best example of where synthesizing past oppression with a new agency to assert culture has been key as a shield for freedom to achieve dignity through participative decision-making by consensus. We must seek new and effective synthesized imagery developed in dialogue between civilizations to capture the imagination among those with different cultural backgrounds and values. A good goal, perhaps, would be to share basic moral values built into culturally different ethical edifices across the world. To get there, imagery and image creation or its reversal are important aids. An approach of this kind can lead to new rules and a new, more inclusive order of things, and perhaps less disorder. This has extra potential in the interpolar, codependent world we have now, where the United States, to some, is being provincialized as others are regionalizing and globalizing. But without the ability of China or India to universalize, however, this may be a propitious moment for breaking the cycle of yet another new hegemony. And it may be the moment at which we can look at a far more pluralistic, pluralizing international politics and international economic choices, without having the need of yet another multipolarity or bipolarity haunt us again. Could this be the historic time where, at the global level, we can contemplate a reconfigured world order in which, in dialogue, like South Africa's in 1994, we find common commitments to a more inclusive global political culture with its shared and meaningful social symbols, values, rules, and victories? I'll leave you with that question, and I thank you very much. And that is the building where Amitav was at home for some time.